When I first moved back into my neighborhood after years of saving and planning, I wanted to make a statement, not through confrontation, but through improvement, something that would give me peace of mind and show that my hard work had paid off, and nothing represented that more than the pool I had built in my backyard. It wasn't just an ordinary pool either, but a modern, crystal clear, luxury style installation with stone decking, built in LED lighting, a small waterfall feature, and a covered lounging area beside it. The kind of pool you saw in glossy magazines and thought only celebrities could own, yet it was mine, the result of endless overtime shifts and months of careful budgeting. And I took pride in knowing I had created a private oasis for myself, a place where I could relax after long days, invite my close friends, or just sit back at night and listen to the soothing rush of water cascading down the rocks. And while most of my neighbors congratulated me and admired the design, one person, the infamous self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association, who everyone mockingly referred to as HOA Karen, saw my pool not as my personal triumph, but as an opportunity for her own twisted sense of entitlement, because Karen had this way of thinking that the entire neighborhood existed as an extension of her personal playground, that any improvement made by a resident was automatically at her disposal, and though I had been warned about her antics long before I finished the pool, I didn't fully appreciate just how brazen she could be until one summer afternoon when I came home from errands and noticed a suspicious crowd gathering near my yard. Not just a handful of people either, but nearly 50 of them, laughing, carrying towels, kids splashing water from filled squirt guns, and adults in swim gear hauling coolers as if they were arriving at a community center rather than my private residence. And at the center of it all was Karen herself, strutting around like a general rallying her troops, barking orders about where people should set up their chairs, and making promises about how the pool is all ours for the day, as though she had personally signed off on it. And my jaw nearly dropped because I couldn't believe the audacity. It wasn't even like she had asked or pretended to request permission. No, she had simply invited half her extended family and some of her friends to march straight onto my property like it was the local YMCA. And when I confronted her, she had the nerve to wave her manicured hand in my face and say, "Don't worry, everyone in the HOA has a right to use shared amenities," as if my backyard pool, funded entirely out of my own pocket, was somehow community property, and my blood boiled at the sheer arrogance of it. But instead of shouting, I took a deep breath and calmly pointed to the lock on my gate, the very lock that had been installed specifically because I knew one day she might try something like this, and informed her that my pool was not, had never been, and never would be a public feature, and the looks on the guests' faces began to shift from excitement to confusion as they realized they weren't going to get the free day of luxury swimming Karen had promised them. And though some started whispering nervously, others just stared at Karen, waiting to see how she'd handle being caught in a lie. And that was when I saw it. The faintest twitch of panic cross her face before she plastered on her fake HOA smile and insisted this was just a misunderstanding, but I knew better. I had heard enough stories about her pressuring other homeowners into giving up their space or tricking newcomers into thinking the HOA owned their private yards. And now it was my turn in the ring. Though unlike the others, I had no intention of backing down because this was my pool, my sanctuary, and if Karen thought she could trample over my property rights in broad daylight with an audience of 50 people, she was in for the rudest awakening of her meddling career. As I stood there facing a sea of 50 bewildered faces, each of them holding towels, floaties, and coolers stuffed with food and drinks they had clearly brought for a full day of swimming, I realized Karen had spun such a convincing narrative that these people genuinely believed they had been invited to some sort of community pool grand opening. And though many of them were starting to look uncomfortable, some even muttering things like, "Wait, this isn't a neighborhood pool," or Karen said, "This was for everyone," Karen herself doubled down with the ferocity of someone who couldn't admit defeat even when cornered, puffing out her chest and trying to stand between me and the gate as if she could shield her dishonesty by sheer arrogance, and she announced loudly, in that shrill tone everyone despised but few dare to challenge, "This homeowner is simply confused. HOA rules state that amenities provided on a member's property can be shared with the community, and this pool is no different. And I couldn't help but laugh, not because it was funny, but because her desperation was so transparent, because there was absolutely no such rule in any HOA handbook, and I knew it because I had read every page of the bylaws after hearing what she had done to others, so I stepped forward, calm but firm, and said loud enough for the crowd to hear, "This pool is on my private property, funded by my private money, and is not, nor has it ever been, an HOA amenity. Anyone who sets foot past this gate without my permission is trespassing, and I will have no problem calling the police." And the silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife, with half the guests glancing nervously at one another, clearly unwilling to risk a legal confrontation for the sake of a swim, and others glaring at Karen as if they finally understood they had been duped. But Karen, unable to admit she was wrong, began huffing about how I was being selfish, how the spirit of community demanded that we share resources, and that if I wanted to live here peacefully, I should start giving back instead of hoarding luxuries for myself. And though I could feel anger rising in my chest, I kept my composure because I had a plan in place for exactly this scenario. One I had crafted the day construction on the pool began, since Karen's reputation was legendary for trying to exploit neighbors, and that plan was the heavy-duty lock and reinforced gate that enclosed my pool area along, with a set of motion sensor cameras pointed squarely at the entryway, cameras that not only recorded everything in real time, but also uploaded to a secure cloud account I could access at any moment. And I made a point of telling Karen this in front of everyone, explaining how any attempt to enter my pool without permission would be recorded, and how the HOA president had already confirmed in writing that my pool was not community property. So any claim she made otherwise was a blatant lie, and as I spoke, I could see the crowd shifting, people packing up their chairs, muttering under their breath about how they had been misled, children whining to their parents that there wasn't going to be a swim party after all, and one woman even snapped at Karen, "Why would you invite us here if you didn't own the pool?" Which only fueled Karen's panic as she tried to wave her arms and shout over the growing tide of dissatisfaction, insisting that I was the liar that I had promised to share the pool when I moved in, which was utterly ridiculous because I had barely exchanged a handful of words with her since arriving in the neighborhood. But the more she spoke, the more her guests abandoned her, walking away in groups, some shooting me apologetic looks as they left, clearly embarrassed they had believed her. And finally, when most of the crowd had dispersed, only a stubborn handful of her closest sycophants remained, standing awkwardly with their towels as if still waiting for Karen to pull a miracle out of thin air. But she had nothing left except sputtering threats about bringing the HOA board down on me, claims about fining me for being unneighborly, and warnings that she would have my pool reclassified as a shared facility, none of which held any water. And I could tell from the way her face turned red and her voice cracked that she knew deep down she had lost control of the situation. So I leaned closer, keeping my voice low so only she could hear, and said, "The difference between you and me, Karen, is that I play by the rules and I don't bluff." And with that, I closed the gate, locked it tight, and walked back inside my house, leaving her standing outside in front of the remaining guests with nothing but her pride shattering around her. And though she shouted after me that this wasn't over, I knew I had struck a blow that would haunt her, because people had seen her lie unravel in real time, and her reputation as the HOA tyrant had taken a hit she couldn't easily recover from. But I also knew Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly. No, she would stew on this humiliation, and when the next opportunity came, she would try again. And that was exactly why I resolved that this was only the beginning of a war she wasn't prepared to fight, because I had patience, evidence, and the law on my side, while all she had left was her crumbling facade of control. The days following Karen's failed takeover of my pool were oddly quiet at first, almost as though she had retreated into hiding to lick her wounds, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the humiliation of being caught lying in front of 50 people had been enough to teach her a lesson. But that fleeting sense of peace didn't last long, because Karen was not the type of person to accept defeat gracefully. No, she was the type to plot in the shadows, waiting for her chance to strike back twice as hard. And it wasn't long before whispers began floating through the neighborhood, subtle comments from other residents who would mention things like, "Karen said you violated HOA landscaping codes," or I heard the board is looking into your property because of noise complaints, and though most of my neighbors had grown tired of Karen's antics years ago, her web of influence still ran deep, and I could tell she was trying to poison my reputation as payback for shutting her down. But the beauty of it was I had already anticipated this sort of underhanded retaliation, which was why I kept meticulous records of everything involving my property, from receipts for pool construction to copies of HOA bylaws, and even a running log of Karen's harassment since the day I moved back, and when I received the first official letter from the HOA notifying me that my pool might need to be made available for community use under some obscure clause about shared amenities. I couldn't help but smirk because I knew exactly whose fingerprints were all over it, and rather than panic, I gathered my paperwork, highlighted the relevant sections of the bylaws, and drafted a polite but firm response citing the HOA president's prior written confirmation that my pool was private, attaching video stills from the day Karen brought her mob over, and sending copies to every member of the board, effectively shredding her attempt before it had even gained traction. And within a week, I received a sheepish apology from the HOA president acknowledging the confusion and clarifying once again that my pool was not subject to community use, which meant Karen had not only failed to undermine me, but had been officially rebuked by the very board she claimed to control. But of course, that didn't stop her. If anything, it only enraged her further because soon after, I began noticing odd little things happening around my property. My trash cans mysteriously knocked over every pickup day. Anonymous notes slipped into my mailbox, accusing me of being a selfish neighbor, and even a few instances where I caught her standing on the sidewalk near my house, phone in hand, clearly taking pictures, as if she was desperately searching for some violation she could use against me. And while her antics might have rattled a weaker person, I had reached the point where her obsession only fueled my determination to outsmart her. And so I took it a step further by improving my pool security, not only keeping the lock reinforced, but also upgrading my cameras to cover multiple angles, installing a system that sent real-time alerts to my phone whenever someone entered the yard, and even adding a small but very visible sign that read, "Private property, trespassers will be prosecuted." A message I knew would burn Karen every time she laid eyes on it because it was a direct reminder of her failure, and sure enough, within days of putting up that sign, she marched past my property muttering loudly about how I was turning the neighborhood into a police state, her voice dripping with bitterness as she glared at the gate she once thought she could waltz through. But here's the thing about bullies like Karen. The more you expose their lies and strip away their power, the more desperate they become. And desperate people make mistakes, mistakes that end up backfiring spectacularly, and I could sense that she was reaching her breaking point, caught between her need to save face and her inability to admit she was wrong, and though most of the neighborhood had seen through her by now, she still had a few loyal followers clinging to her promises of community improvement. So she started planting the idea that my pool was a safety hazard, telling anyone who would listen that children in the area were at risk because I was hoarding a pool behind locked gates instead of letting everyone use it under her so-called supervision, which was absurd not only because no law required me to let strangers into my yard, but also because the pool had been built to the highest safety standards with proper fencing, locks, and permits. And when I overheard one of her cronies parroting this nonsense at the local coffee shop, I realized Karen was setting the stage for something bigger, something reckless. And that's when I doubled down, making sure all my legal ducks were in a row, speaking again with the HOA president, who reassured me that Karen's claims carried no weight, and even having a brief chat with a local police officer I knew socially, explaining the situation so there would be no confusion if I had to make a call about trespassers in the future. And though I hated the idea of escalation, I couldn't shake the sense that Karen's pride had been so deeply wounded that she would rather risk legal consequences than admit she had been wrong. And in a twisted way, I almost looked forward to it because the thought of watching her plan blow up in her face again was the kind of justice that made enduring her petty games almost worthwhile, and so I waited, patient and prepared, knowing it was only a matter of time before Karen's desperation pushed her into making the kind of mistake I could use to finally, permanently dismantle her reign of entitlement once and for all. It didn't take long for Karen to make her next move, and when it finally came, it was so predictably reckless that I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, though at the time I had to stay stone-faced to keep control of the situation, because one sweltering Saturday afternoon I returned home from running errands to find, yet again, a group of people gathered near my property, though this time it wasn't 50 guests in swimwear ready to dive in. It was a smaller but more determined group of Karen's diehard loyalists, about a dozen in total, standing awkwardly at the edge of my driveway, while Karen herself was pacing in front of my locked pool gate, holding a ring of what looked suspiciously like bolt cutters in her hand, and my stomach clenched with both fury and disbelief, because this woman had clearly decided that since she couldn't manipulate the rules or intimidate me into handing over access, she was going to bypass me entirely and physically break into my pool, and what's worse is that she had convinced these people to come along as witnesses, probably to frame it as some sort of community liberation act, as though they were storming the Bastille instead of trespassing on private property, and I quietly parked down the street to watch for a moment before walking up, my phone already recording, because I wanted evidence of everything, every word, every action, and sure enough, Karen was in full performance mode, waving the bolt cutters around and shouting about how selfish I was, how unfair it was for one person to have such a beautiful pool while the community sweltered in the summer heat, and her cronies nodded along half-heartedly, though from the looks on their faces it was obvious some of them were having second thoughts, their eyes darting nervously to the cameras I had installed, which were clearly visible above the gate and blinking their little red lights like silent guardians of my property, and as I approached, Karen spotted me and immediately launched into her rehearsed speech, declaring loudly, "You can't keep this locked away forever. We have rights as members of this community, and today we're taking them back." And I swear the sheer drama of her words would have been comical, if not for the fact that she was literally seconds away from committing a crime. So I stepped forward, phone raised, and said firmly, "Karen, you're trespassing right now, and if you cut that lock, you'll be charged with property damage on top of it. This is your last warning." But instead of backing down, she tried to spin the situation, pointing at me like some villain in her twisted narrative and shouting to her followers, "See, he's threatening us. He doesn't care about the neighborhood, only himself." And while a few of her lackeys murmured in agreement, most of them looked even more uncomfortable, some taking slow steps backward, unwilling to be part of what was clearly spiraling into a disaster. And then, right on cue, one of my cameras let out a beep, signaling it had detected motion and started live streaming to my cloud account, and I smiled, telling Karen in a calm but cutting voice, "Congratulations, you're on camera, live, recorded and time-stamped. Go ahead and show the world how far you're willing to go." And that was when her facade began to crack, her hand tightening on the bolt cutters as her face flushed red, torn between the pride that wouldn't let her back down and the fear of knowing she was caught in the act. And for a tense moment, I wondered if she might actually snap the lock out of spite. But then one of her followers spoke up, a middle-aged man who looked exasperated as he said, "Karen, this isn't right. We're breaking the law." And another woman added nervously, "I didn't sign up to get arrested over a pool." And slowly, one by one, her support crumbled as they shuffled away, leaving Karen standing alone, humiliated yet again, still gripping the bolt cutters but no longer with anyone to cheer her on. And when I pulled out my phone to call the police, she panicked, dropping the tool with a loud clang against the pavement and shrieking, "You can't do this to me. I run this neighborhood," which only made the scene more pathetic because there she was, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, reduced to a flustered woman caught red-handed trying to break into someone else's property. And though part of me wanted to press charges right then and there, I decided to play the long game, so I told her calmly, "You've been warned, and the footage is saved. I won't press charges today, but the next time you or anyone you send steps foot on my property without permission, I'll make sure the cops handle it, and you'll have no one to blame but yourself." And with that, I picked up the bolt cutters, held them up to the camera, and tossed them into my garage as further evidence, then closed the gate and walked inside, leaving Karen to stew in her humiliation, her shrieks fading into frustrated sobs as she stomped off toward her house. And though I knew this wasn't the end, I also knew I had just dealt her another devastating blow, because now not only had she'd been caught in a lie, she had been caught nearly committing a crime in broad daylight, with witnesses abandoning her, and her once firm grip on the neighborhood was slipping faster than she could scramble to hold it. And for the first time since I moved back, I felt like the balance of power was shifting not just for me, but for every neighbor who had ever been bullied by Karen's false authority, because now they had proof that she wasn't untouchable, and I could sense that her downfall, though not yet complete, was inevitable. And when it came, I planned to be right there to watch her empire of entitlement crumble into dust. After the bolt cutter fiasco, the neighborhood began buzzing with stories, and while Karen tried her best to spin the narrative, claiming I had fabricated the entire situation, that the tools were planted, and that she was merely checking on the safety of the gate, her excuses fell flat because too many people had seen her standing there red-faced, too many had heard her rally cries, and most importantly, the video footage circulating among the community group chats told the truth more powerfully than any excuse she could concoct. And with each passing day, her credibility eroded further until even her most loyal supporters started to keep their distance, whispering apologies to me when Karen wasn't around, admitting that they had grown tired of being dragged into her personal vendettas. And though Karen's pride was still intact enough to keep her marching around the neighborhood like she owned it, I could tell her foundation was crumbling beneath her feet. And then came the HOA board meeting, the one that everyone had been dreading yet anticipating, because for the first time in years, residents weren't afraid to show up en masse, and the room was packed with people who had grievances against Karen, people who had once stayed silent, but were now emboldened by her very public failure. And when I entered the room carrying a small flash drive loaded with clips from my security cameras, I could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the energy of neighbors finally ready to push back, and Karen, seated at the front with her usual air of smug superiority, looked visibly shaken when she saw how many people had gathered, though she still tried to hold her head high, starting the meeting with her usual condescending tone as she outlined community concerns about my pool, claiming it created a hazard, a disruption, and an eyesore, which drew groans and mutters from the crowd, because everyone knew the pool was gorgeous, perfectly maintained, and far from being a nuisance. And when it was my turn to speak, I didn't waste time with emotional arguments. Instead, I calmly plugged in the flash drive and played the clips for everyone to see, showing Karen's mob of 50 guests standing at my gate, her lies about community access, and most damning of all, the footage of her standing with bolt cutters in her hand, poised to break in while her so-called allies abandoned her one by one, and the room erupted, not in laughter, though some couldn't help but chuckle, but in a wave of gasps, angry whispers, and calls for accountability. And the HOA president, a man who had long been seen as Karen's silent enabler, shifted uncomfortably in his seat before finally clearing his throat and admitting that there had never been any rules supporting Karen's claims, that my pool was unquestionably private property, and that Karen's actions were deeply concerning, which was HOA speak for indefensible, and as neighbors began standing to recount their own horror stories of Karen's bullying, fines for imaginary violations, harassment over lawn decorations, demands that went far beyond the scope of HOA authority, it became clear that this meeting had turned into more than just a discussion about my pool. It had become a referendum on Karen's entire reign of intimidation. And though she tried desperately to regain control, interrupting speakers, accusing me of doctoring the footage, even threatening to sue the HOA itself, her voice was drowned out by the collective frustration of a community that had finally had enough. And when the president called for a vote on whether to censure her for misconduct, the room practically roared in unison, with hands shooting into the air. And though the board stopped short of stripping her of her membership entirely, they did issue a formal written warning, publicly recorded in the minutes, which was something Karen had never faced before, a permanent stain on her record that everyone could point to the next time she tried to throw her weight around. And I watched her face as the reality sank in, the way her lips trembled as she tried to force her trademark smirk, the way her eyes darted nervously around the room as if looking for an ally, only to find none. And for the first time, Karen looked small, not because she physically shrank, but because the aura of invincibility she had cultivated for so long was gone, stripped away by her own arrogance and the undeniable evidence of her behavior. And when the meeting adjourned, neighbors who had once feared crossing her came up to me with smiles, handshakes, and even pats on the back, thanking me for standing up to her, for documenting everything, for giving them the courage to speak out. And I realized then that this wasn't just about my pool anymore. It was about restoring balance to a neighborhood that had been under Karen's thumb for too long. And though she stormed out of the meeting with a huff, muttering about appealing the decision and taking it to the county, I knew she was scrambling, her power base shattered, her credibility in tatters, and I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that my patience, preparation, and refusal to bow to her had not only protected my sanctuary, but had also ignited a spark of rebellion among my neighbors, a spark that Karen couldn't extinguish no matter how many threats she hurled. And as I walked home that night beneath the warm glow of streetlights, I felt lighter, freer, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, though in the back of my mind I still kept my guard up because Karen was nothing if not persistent, and even a cornered tyrant could lash out one last time. But this time, I was ready for whatever storm she thought she could summon. In the weeks that followed the HOA meeting, the neighborhood seemed to breathe easier, as though an oppressive cloud had finally lifted. And while Karen still strutted around with her usual bluster, it was clear her grip on power had loosened beyond repair, because where once people would scramble to appease her demands, now they crossed the street to avoid her, rolling their eyes when she barked orders or tried to enforce non-existent rules, and instead of the fearful silence she used to inspire, her presence was met with open laughter and muttered jokes, and though she tried desperately to claw back her influence by spreading wild rumors about me, that I had bribed the HOA board, that my pool was riddled with health code violations, that I was secretly planning to rent it out for money, her words carried no weight anymore. Not when the truth was staring everyone in the face, shimmering in the form of my pristine, sparkling pool that I enjoyed freely whenever I pleased, often, with invited guests who marveled at the ridiculousness of Karen's downfall, and while she glared from across the street, gnashing her teeth as if my every splash was a personal insult, I made it a point to smile, wave, and carry on as if she didn't exist, because nothing infuriated a control freak more than being ignored. And yet, even in her diminished state, I knew better than to underestimate her, which is why I maintained my vigilance, keeping my cameras running, my logs updated, and my gate firmly locked, not out of paranoia, but out of principle, because Karen's history had taught me that she would never fully accept defeat. Only bide her time until she thought she could catch me off guard. But as the summer stretched on and no new scheme surfaced, I realized something important. I had already won, not just in the sense that my pool remained private and untouched, but in the broader sense that Karen's reign had been broken, her power neutered by her own hubris, and now the neighborhood was uniting not under her thumb, but against her antics, neighbors who had once kept to themselves now sharing barbecues, exchanging stories, even planning a block party that explicitly did not include Karen on the planning committee, and the irony of it all wasn't lost on me. That the very pool she had tried to claim as her own had become the symbol of her undoing, a shining reminder to everyone that entitlement and bullying only led to downfall, and one evening, as I floated on, my back staring up at the stars, I thought about how close things had come to chaos, how easily she might have manipulated the situation if I hadn't been prepared, and I felt a quiet pride in knowing that I had not only protected what was mine, but also helped others find their voices, and that, more than the pool itself, was the real victory because Karen's power was never about rules or authority, it was about fear, and once that fear was broken, she was nothing more than a loud neighbor with. Too much time on her hands, a nuisance but no longer a threat, and though she still occasionally hurled passive-aggressive comments when passing by, snide remarks about how selfish I was or how the pool looked too flashy for the neighborhood, her words slid off me like water against the smooth stone tiles of my oasis, meaningless and impotent, and eventually she grew quieter, her presence fading into the background as her influence evaporated completely, until one day I overheard someone mention that she was considering selling her house, that the embarrassment and loss of power had finally become too much for her to bear. And though part of me almost pitied her, remembering the way she once commanded a room with sheer force of personality, the larger part of me knew it was only fitting that this was the natural end of a tyrant, undone not by violence or scandal, but by the truth and the resilience of those who refuse to be bullied. And so, as I locked the gate behind me one final time that night, the soft glow of pool lights dancing across the water, I couldn't help but smile at the poetic justice of it all. Because the woman who once believed she could invite 50 guests to my pool and claim it as her own had been reduced to a cautionary tale, a reminder to everyone that entitlement and arrogance could never outlast patience, preparation, and the simple act of standing firm. And in that moment, I knew Karen's panic wasn't just about a pool she couldn't control, it was about a kingdom she had lost forever.